So I was having trouble sleeping tonight, and I'm sure that you probably have similar kinds of nights where maybe you're not being in the present too much, and your thoughts start to wander. And as I mentioned, I've had some genetically based health issue that I've had to deal with just recently. That's been taking up some time as well as some headspace. And it's easy for things to start getting out of control a little bit in your mind. So I was wondering tonight, I was thinking, well, you know how sometimes there's so many things happening in the world that you just kind of think, oh, there's so many things happening, I'm not exactly sure what to focus on. That's kind of where I'm at lately. And I was walking along, I was on a really long walk today. And while I was walking, I was listening to a podcast by Escrow. I forget the whole name of the podcast, but Ben Norton was on there, and he was talking about how Wikipedia has basically suffocated the grey zone and has relegated it to basically the same level as Epoch Times, which is a really trashy fake news Falun Gong funded news source that actually they have a lot of money, but they're actually putting out heaps of anti-Chinese propaganda. Well, that's where the grey zone has been relegated to in Wikipedia, which is basically become ossified now, and is, basically there's a limited amount of editors, and it's able to be edited by the CIA, by Zionists in Israel. It's kind of really, really tightly controlled now, and has been for some time. And it's just become a big propaganda arm, and unfortunately it has a huge following. It has a huge sort of a prominence on Google when you search for things. It's in the top 5. So basically it's trying to kind of suffocate the grey zone, and I don't think they'll ever be able to pull out of that. And just in case you don't follow this channel, the Grey Zone is a really excellent left alternative journalist site that is pretty much, apart from some small errors that Ben Norton talked about, they've never really had to retract anything that they've said, and that's one of the reasons why Wikipedia dislikes it so much, and is doing its best to kind of suffocate it. Wikimedia is the parent company of Wikipedia, and it's the person who is ahead of that is, I think her name's Catherine Ma, and she has a long history of being involved in organizations that sort of are regime change organizations, like the NDI, that kind of thing. So really, that's Wikipedia for you. Anyway, that's a very short version of it. So Ben Norton, who's a really wonderful journalist, he explained that very well, and I invite you to please check out that podcast on YouTube about that, because it's some very important information and does not bode well for left perspective journalists. This is how they censor. They do through algorithms. That's how they censor, and that's the way they do it. So they can still say, look, the grey zone exists. There's still free speech and everything, and yet they're suffocating anybody's access to it. So anyhow, that's that in a nutshell, and I might try and pull out some excerpts of that by Ben Norton, because I think it's essential listening. So anyway, that's kind of depressing. But anyway, I was listening to Michael Moore tonight too, talking about Rayshard Brooks, and I disagree with a lot that Michael Moore has done in the past. When he kind of promotes Hillary Clinton, and he's all over the place in some ways in my eyes. But he seems to have turned a corner on some things, like he's not doing the typical supporting the Democratic Party like he usually does. He doesn't, like he was talking about Joe Biden today, and he said, Joe Biden turned up for George Floyd's the day before George Floyd's funeral and met with relatives of George Floyd, but he didn't turn up to the actual funeral, and he basically sort of implied that, well, it was a 5-hour funeral and Joe Biden just could not handle that, cognitively. It's just too long. And I'm thinking, well, exactly. And everybody knows when he didn't elaborate, but he said, the funeral was 5 hours. And he kind of paused, and you know exactly what he means when he says, the funeral was 5 hours. You know that what he means is Joe Biden wouldn't be able to sit through something like that, and he'd probably get extremely tired because, he's really going through some cognitive stuff, and they don't have him on medications all the time to make him sparky and look like he's handling things and look like he's able to finish a thought and that kind of thing. So, I think to myself, well, there you go. This is one of the main runners for the most powerful country in the world. And then we have this other cognitively impaired Republican who seems to be getting more and more desperate. He's throwing tantrums on Twitter because the Supreme Court is making judgments that he doesn't like. He's also encouraging his base, the very frightened white male base that feels like they're going extinct, and I'm being sarcastic when I say that. He's encouraging them to maybe he's inciting violence in some ways for this march, this protest in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I watched a little bit of his interview with Donald J. Trump Jr., his son, today, just to have a peek and see what nonsense, what, the kind of things that they go on patting one another on the back and saying a lot of stuff that isn't true, like, you're doing a great job and things have never been better, Donald, the one Donald to the other. They're patting one another on the back and being all folksy, and then talking about Donald Trump Jr.'s beard and how Donald Trump Sr. doesn't like the beard. And meanwhile, I'm thinking all these people's lives, like there's 40 million people out of work with no end in sight for how that, and a lot of them haven't even received that $1,200, that pitiful $1,200 that would have gone just like that. And here they are kind of patting one another on the back. It's for want of a better word, I'm sorry, I don't mean to use ableist words, but it's just watching this sort of thing, particularly when you don't even live in the United States. It's kind of insane, really. It's just sort of like, it's like the center cannot hold, that the Falcon or whatever, it's all spinning apart, and I don't know who believes this stuff. I know that, as Michael Moore was saying, that Trump doesn't have to worry about his white male base. They're not going to abandon him no matter what he does. He could, like he joked about earlier on in his presidency, he could kill somebody in 5th Street, he could shoot somebody, and it would be okay. Well, I actually in some ways agree with that. He's not going to lose his white male base. Does that base, which is just as badly affected as the black people are in the United States with how things are being run, the neoliberal mess that it is, the inverted totalitarian state that they have, corporations running the show basically, dictating to government what they should be doing. Do those white people, those white people are as negatively affected as anybody. Of course, black people, there's a systemic structural racism that intentionally keeps them in poverty and disadvantaged. But I mean, they're, basically the inverted totalitarian state is affecting a lot of people now. It's not just minority groups. So, when they support this man, Trump, or any of those in this big party, the duopoly, they're voting against their interests, basically. Anybody who votes for either candidate is voting against their interests. And you know that, I know that. I don't know if they know that, but I wish they knew that, because that man doesn't really give a toss about them. He will use them to hammer the left and to terrorize black people, like the lynchings that are happening in California. There's been 2 or 3 or 4 even. 2 black men hanging from trees. I think one was in Palmdale and the other one, I can't remember where the other one was. He's inciting repeatedly a kind of a civil war. A recent tweet he had was just about basically vilifying anybody on the left, anybody who wants basically equity and equality and social justice, anybody who wants that. He's vilifying them to blazes. This is Donald Trump on Twitter. And inciting violence, wanting his right-wing white men to, nationalists to kick some heads, basically. That's what's going on there. So this is who's running the country. And for all that, Joe Biden, he does this sort of thing of trying to make out that he's the stable and reliable one, and he's even said nothing's going to change if he got in to be president. Well, that's fabulous because everything's crap, so if he's reassuring everybody nothing's going to change, so the crap situation you've got, people, is not going to change. Don't worry. This is, it's like a sideshow. It's like a circus. Not that we have anything great here. We don't in Australia. I mean, Scott Morrison is an authoritarian wannabe. He loves what Trump does, and he takes notes. For sure, he takes notes of what Donald Trump does. And we've got somebody worse than that who wants to be Prime Minister, Peter Dutton, who is an outright fascist. He's frightening, He's in some ways probably more frightening than Donald Trump because he can string sentences together, and he's really scary, Peter Dutton. This is what we have here. God, I don't know how we've managed to end up with the people we have. Like the quality of, not that the quality of politicians was great a couple of decades ago, but these people make those people look like geniuses. And the days of Gough Whitlam, who was a Democratic Socialist Prime Minister, who the CIA, and I've mentioned this before, has admitted helping get rid of. He was the best Prime Minister, we ever had, and he had really changed things. Free healthcare, free public education. He was great. He was for Indigenous rights and all of that, and they got rid of him. He didn't want to play ball with the US, and that's a cardinal sin. He was against the Vietnam War, and he was not for these imperialist wars that the US was ongoing engaged in. So that was a cardinal sin, and they helped get rid of him. We don't have anything like him anymore. Anything like him. Any party. We've got more than 2 parties here, but they've got the major hold on things, the Labour Party and the Coalition, but there's nobody in there that's really anything like Gough Whitlam. So we have really nothing to look forward to here in the future as far as anything politically, and that's why grassroots movements have always been where it's at. You have to have a non-violent grassroots movement to change things, because you cannot change things top down. And that's what has to be done in the US, of course, and there's so many people working towards that, but it's a powerful, sewn-up structure at this point. A dysfunctional, corrupt structure with corrupt elections, pretending that it's not that, pretending all the time that it's not that. That's really hard to watch. The lies, the outright lies. It's like having dysfunctional parents, and they're driving a car out of control all over the road, and they're approaching a cliff, and you're sitting in the back of the car, you're a child, you can't get out of the car, and you're asking them, please slow down, and they're saying, nothing's wrong, everything's great, honey, don't worry. We're going for a drive and everything's going to be great. Everything's wonderful. And you can see them careering here and careering there, knocking people over. The car's getting more and more beaten up. And they're saying, don't worry, honey, it's all right. Everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine. You know that meme that we see often on Twitter and elsewhere of the dog sitting in the burning house and looking kind of a bit cracked, looking and sort of going, everything's fine. Everything's fine. Yeah, that's sort of what it's like, isn't it, really? Which leads me to something, I don't want this to be too long, but which leads me to something that, I was thinking about therapy, and I used to go to therapy in the 90s, and that was very good for me because I was sort of having a bad depression during the 90s. I'm not sure exactly why, but I was, and I pulled out of that, and I had some medication at one point, and that was also good for me, having the medication. It helped. It was just, sort of serotonin uptake stuff. I probably could have done better if I'd been doing a lot more exercise, but you know what it's like if you've ever had depression, clinical depression in particular. The idea, it's like almost getting to the door of the house seems like this endless road that keeps getting longer and longer. So it's really hard to actually even get to the door, to go outside, to then get on the road or get in your car and go somewhere to get... It's a bit like that. So, but, exercise, a lot of exercise is very good, can be almost as good as that. I'm not saying that's going to treat any sort of depression, but to some degree it's been very successful. Anyway, I'm getting off the track there, but so in the 90s, yeah, and then it's been pretty good since then. I still get it, but it's nowhere near like that. But I was thinking about, when one goes to therapy, something that a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists don't really address, and that is the shit show that's happening all over the world that in many ways we can't control. You can do something to try and mitigate some of these things, or like join, as I say, grassroots movements, but as far as, say, addressing, you can do things to try and address the climate crisis, but really a lot of people at this point think that it's too late. I do as well, and I have since 2013, just looking at the science, and of course every day, if you follow things like this, which I don't anymore because I don't really want to know how bad it is now. I already see that it's bad enough that it's a feedback loop that is going to go exponentially, and people aren't going to notice how bad it is until agriculture starts shutting down in a big way and people start starving, that kind of thing. It's hard to actually gauge. Like if you were living where I'm living and everything looks beautiful and normal, you wouldn't think anything sinister is happening globally, but because we are all plugged in and we're aware of what's going on, a lot of us through online access and all of that, one knows what's happening. The permafrost is melting, and East Siberian Arctic shelf, it's melting there, and even if just 1% of that methane came up, it would raise things a few degrees in a very short period of time, and things would be very pear-shaped then, that kind of thing. That's sort of happening now. That's just one of a gazillion things that are happening in relation to climate, the climate emergency. And of course now we've been all sort of taken in by the COVID thing, which of course that's been an emergency, and everybody's been too focused on that, and we've all forgotten to some degree about the climate emergency. And then of course there's this massive economic meltdown in the US. This is like an escalated version of what everybody was experiencing there, where they were already financially struggling. Now they're in this dire situation, which in some ways, I know I'm kind of going over the place here. I'll get back to the psychology thing in a minute, but I've actually said to my partner, I've said, in some ways I just wish they'd get it over with, what's going on in the US, just rip it off and get it over with. They want everybody to be serfs. They basically want to abandon the public to their own devices and not give them any support at all. Just get it over with instead of putting these poor people through this slow, agonizing abandonment. Because if people are they're absolutely aware that they're completely abandoned, absolutely abandoned. Everybody, I'm not just talking about certain minority groups that they've abandoned the government, have abandoned them, pretty much, in many ways. I'm talking about an abandonment on a massive scale with a whole bunch of people. Well, that in many ways is happening right now. The COVID pandemic has given them the excuse to really, not only abandon people, but then buy up their assets because they're in a major economic emergency. What's happened there, what's happening right now, and has inspired a lot of people to get out on the streets, not just for the George Floyd murder, but because there's a lot more going on with these protests than just the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter, which of course is very important, but that's also part of the greater issue, which is that the government is not your friend, has never been your friend. They are oligarchs and a big kleptocracy, and you are irrelevant, basically. The politics of disposability. And so these protests are that. And I'm hoping that because this COVID thing has really ripped off the mask, ripped off the Band-Aid really quickly, instead of just degrees of agony, I'm hoping that people there will clearly see that neither party is their friend. And Anar Muharesh actually did a very short video on Minpress News just recently on YouTube saying that she's noticed that people in these protests are actually starting to say, let's get rid of the duopoly. Now, isn't that brilliant? Let's get rid of the duopoly, because they're starting to see, and she says that's very exciting, they're starting to see these two major parties, which are just really one big party with the far right and then the right wing and the far right. And they're a big war party, and they're working for corporations, and the corporations are throwing them money. People are starting to see it for what it is. Now that's what you need. And this is what's so frightening to the 1% and the political class, the capitalist class, that people will realize that this neoliberal capitalist death machine has to end. They'll realize what the real problem is. They won't be looking at the symptoms, they'll be looking at the cause of all of this. And see, that's a most important thing. If people start, and that's what the political class and the capitalist class and all these oligarchs are afraid of, that people will wake up to this game, that the monopoly game where there's a small number of people own everything. And that's what they're most frightened of, and that's why they want to shut down the protests, because they can see that people are starting to catch on, and this COVID pandemic and the abandonment of Americans, and all over the world there's been abandonment to some degree, but nothing like the US government has abandoned people. They're afraid that people are going to really catch on to the game, and they're really waking up. And that is the most scary thing, and that's why they want to shut it down. That's why the Democratic Party is trying to co-opt these protests, because they want people to settle down, and they want everything to go back to quote-unquote normal. And that the Democratic Party is doing their best to co-opt this movement, and the Republican Party and Donald Trump are trying their best to create some sort of civil war between the nationalists, the white supremacist nationalist base, and the left wing and leftists. And I'm talking about real leftists now, not the pretend left that is the Democratic Party and people like them and celebrities and such. As terrible as this is, seeing the terrible suffering, which has just been made much worse, in some ways it had to happen. Like I said, I've thought to myself, Jesus, just get it over with. Get it over with and stop torturing these people. if you've ever read some of the America, the Farewell Tour by Chris Hedges, some of the stories in that are just so gut-wrenchingly sad, and it could happen to anybody because of the lack of support, the way the predatory lending system, neoliberalism, the capitalism. It's a death machine, and it's inherently exploitative, and nothing good can come of it really in the end. And it has the seeds of its own destruction, as Marx has said. It has the seeds of its own destruction built in, and it's actually hollowing itself out at this point. It's like a cancer that's run out of things to consume in a way. So this is where it's at. We're watching the destruction of a country. We're watching it devour itself, and we're watching the capitalist class and the 1% kind of freaking out at this point because they know they're trying to sort of basically secure everything, but at the same time, the people that actually consume their products and all of that at this point can't even really afford to consume. And that's where you can actually bring down these various, like Amazon. If people stop consuming products from Amazon, Jeff Bezos, he'd lose his company in no time. I mean, we're supporting that, really. And I know that a lot of people can't get products from anywhere else but Amazon. They've got it so sewn up in some ways. But they rely on us to keep them going. And they rely on their workers. If everybody in Amazon just said, okay, strike, that'd bring that whole company down on its knees. Anyway, I'm getting off the back to just, I'm going to wrap this up because it's getting a bit long now. There's a lot I could talk about, but maybe I'll save that for other times. But what I was going to say about psychology is I've noticed that because things have become much worse in Australia with the neoliberal slide, it's like we're heading the way of the United States. If they could have their way, some of these politicians would end up like the United States, and that's what some of them want. And with that, of course, there's a lot of people in debt now in Australia. So the powers that be sort of think, well, we better provide more psychologists and give them, say, 10 sessions free a year to see a psychologist, which is basically just maintenance stuff. We'll make sure that people can sort of handle this ongoing difficulties, the stresses that they're putting on the public with the neoliberal policies. So they provide, some more psychologists, but it's not really very good, really. They've sort of been saying everybody should look after their mental health, and there's been a great rise in depression in Australia because of a lot has to do with, how the public are being treated by the government. But they're trying to get people to, instead of thinking that it's the government's fault and the way things are managed, that, you have to manage it yourself, your mental health, and have to be resilient. That's the other thing. They want you to be resilient and to handle more and more crap that they keep putting on us. All these different mental health things and the encouraging people to meditate. This is also we can handle more and more pressure that these governments that are allowing corporations to dictate to them, that these governments are putting on the public. And that's unacceptable. We should be looking at the people running things and organizing to bring down these destructive systems instead of blaming ourselves because we're not handling it, or we're not handling debt, or we're not good enough, or whatever, or thinking positively and all that kind of stuff. I mean, thinking positively, of course, but I mean, the whole systems are breaking down, and we're going to have to stop sucking it up, basically. This sucking it up and trying to find ways to be mentally healthy in a dysfunctional system and in a dysfunctional system and a dysfunctional society that creates dysfunction in society. That is an abomination that they should be getting us to do that. And also setting up charities to do the work of what governments should be doing. That's another thing. It's a whole other problem. Charities, creating this non-profit industrial complex to pick up the slack of what governments are not doing. And there's so much that they're not doing. What I'm trying to say about the psychology is, psychologists most of them don't address this umbrella of dysfunction, that the climate emergency, which looks like we're going to go extinct by the middle of the century or 2060, and taking everybody else with us, all the non-humans, and that's one reason I'm vegan, but I'm vegan because they're not our property, and I invite people to please go vegan. But that's a major emergency that everybody on some level in the world is aware of. And I think that's why a lot of people get so engrossed in all kinds of things online, cat videos and sort of gaming, playing games all the time, and all of that, because on some level we're animals and we know something is very wrong, and because we're so plugged in to everything that's happening, just overwhelmed with information, we can see that things are not okay, and that's becoming more and more coming into the consciousness of most of the world. So when you go to a psychologist, there's only so much they can, you can talk about. Well, one of my problems is that we're probably going to go extinct, and meanwhile, while we're doing all this daily activities and etc., etc., and meanwhile everything is, our very life system, support system, the planet, is falling apart and is probably going to kill us. How can you keep mentally healthy if you're aware of that, and that there's very little you can do? You can go vegan, you can be part of a grassroots movement that pushes for different things, but to be honest, to be really blunt with you, exponentially things are out of control now. There's positive feedback loops, and we won't realize how bad it is until systems like agricultural systems truly majorly break down, and there's really major food shortages. And if we think that how people were during the COVID pandemic was kind of nuts, just wait until that starts happening. So, there's things like that, and also the neoliberal mess that's been created for us that people are drowning in, and governments have no intentions of stopping, just as capitalism has no intentions of stopping until it consumes everything on the planet. That's one of the reasons we are where we are. All of those things, it's almost like there's little that we can actually do. We can't vote these people out, and people seem to be voting against their interests. I don't know why people are voting against their interests, but it seems like we've got some sort of death drive at this point, truly. I don't know why anybody would vote either of those parties in the United States, or why they would vote for this right-wing corporate-owned party we have, the coalition. Why they would vote them in again, and they did, and they might even vote them in again. I don't know. It's almost like some people just want it all to come crashing down and end. How sad is that, How sad is that things have become so anti-people and anti, the planet, that people just want things to just everything to fucking die, basically. There are some people that want that. I want things to come crashing down in a different way, meaning I want these systems to come crashing down so that we can just start again, because they're anti-people. It's a death machine. Anyway, so, psychologists don't address those sort of things that are happening that are overarching, very influential things on our mental health. And of course there's more depression now. If anybody thinks that things are fine and they're happy as a lark, they're either not paying attention or they're completely in denial, or they're incredibly wealthy and they think they have nothing to worry about, as if their little bunkers are going to save them. They're not going to save them from this. Anyway, so these psychological services that are provided for people will never address that. And that I see as a major flaw in how therapy is conducted today. It's sort of ridiculous too. It's like having somebody, you're sitting in a chair and somebody's in a pool drowning in front of you, and you're just sitting there saying, so tell me how you're feeling today. And meanwhile they're drowning and gasping for air. It's sort of like that. Anyway, I better wrap it up because we're getting on to 42 minutes, and I didn't want this to be long, but I don't seem to be able to do short things sometimes. But anyway, thank you for listening to me just waffling on. I thought I would just check in with you, and I'm sure there's probably some things I've said that resonate with you. There's a lot more I can say, and I'll probably be doing this more regularly. If you find this at all comforting or distressing, I don't know what you think of my wafflings, but let me know, because I like to mix it up on this channel. There's nobody I have to particularly please. I just do this for myself, but I also recognize there are people who are following this channel that identify with different things I talk about. We're all just people on this planet together. We're all just trying to do our best, and hopefully we're trying to make it better for sentient beings. That means animals and non-human animals and human animals. Hopefully we're trying to do that, and trying to, at the very least, lessen future suffering, at the very least, future suffering and death. And that includes people who are being affected terribly by the Western imperialist, endless wars. That's all. I hope we're trying to do that. If you follow this channel, you've probably got an interest in that. And it's not easy, but it's something that we all have to do. We have to do it. We have to keep on. We have to try and be kind to others every single day. And we have to work for justice, and we have to support people that are really working for justice, like the alternate journalists who are trying to present, despite these massive suppression and censorship, they're trying to present really what's going on. We have to do as many things as we possibly can, and also take care of our mental health at the same time. And that's a very tricky balance of keeping informed, doing activism, and trying to, at the same time, be mentally healthy. I struggle with that, and that's why I continue to do the be here now, sort of being in the present, not living in the future and not ruminating about the past, and that works very well for me. Sometimes, like with this genetic health scare that I've had, it's kind of thrown me out a bit with that. And, and I can quickly get into anxiety levels, which can be very difficult sometimes to rein in. That's just sort of something I have a very sensitive system that can kind of quickly get into an anxiety thing. But I'm learning what the triggers are for that and how to manage it. And the Be Here Now thing, I've been doing incredibly well with that, just feeling really happy, not being in some kind of a space where you're just not thinking, you're not acknowledging that what's going on, but not allowing myself to get too bogged down in it, meaning, where I'm actually feeling terrible about it in a negative way that is making me less able to be an activist and to function properly, and to where it's damaging to yourself. I've managed to create a situation for myself where I can do both now. I can be feeling very happy and enjoying incredibly simple things in life, being in the present, and I can do those things. So I've sort of managed to work out a pretty good balance, except for when I feel sick, and then it goes off the rails a little bit, but then I kind of get back on track again. That's life, isn't it? Sort of, it truly is, life is a series of difficult situations, and I'm a white person. I don't have anywhere near the challenges that people in other countries that are being oppressed by Western imperialist forces, and also by US citizens that are being crushed by inverted totalitarianism. I don't have that level of struggle. We all have our different things, don't we? And I don't like to see anybody struggling, ever, in the world. Because anybody who's struggling, like that saying goes, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and that's absolutely true. Anyway, so I'll wrap it up here and stop yammering on, so thanks so much for listening. I'll talk to you soon. Please be safe. Please look after your health, your mental health in particular, at this very difficult time. And please do whatever you can to make others' lives easier. And let's just be kind to one another, and let's keep pushing for justice for those who are most oppressed in the world, because we need to be internationalists. Okay, thanks for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Viga. Till next time. Bye for now.